My family has owned this land since before this place was officially even considered county. I'm talking generations upon generations working the same soil, raising livestock, planting crops, and building a life here long before anybody dreamed of luxury subdivisions and HOA meetings. My great-great-grandfather started this farm back in 1887. Not 1987 to 1887. That means for well over a century, my family has been part of this community. We were here before paved roads, before shopping centers, before developers started carving up farmland to build rows of identical houses with decorative mailboxes. So when a brand new subdivision called Whispering Pines got built right next to our property, we honestly didn't think much about it. We kept doing what we'd always done. Farming. We minded our business, worked our land, took care of the animals, and carried on the same traditions my family had followed for generations. After all, we were there first. The problem started small. One afternoon, I found a neatly folded notice sitting in our mailbox. It came from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, the HOA. The letter was polite enough on the surface, but the message was crystal clear. They claimed some of our farming equipment was visually disruptive to the aesthetic of their pristine neighborhood streets. I laughed when I read it. We weren't members of their HOA. Their rules had absolutely nothing to do with us. Our farm had been operating there for over 100 years. Surely these people understood they couldn't move next to farmland and suddenly pretend the farm was the problem. So I ignored the letter completely. A week later, another notice showed up. This time they were complaining about our rooster, Henry. Apparently his crowing in the early morning hours was creating excessive noise disturbances for residents of the subdivision. The letter even referenced county noise ordinances that, as far as I knew, didn't apply to agricultural property in the first place. At that point, I realized this wasn't some harmless misunderstanding. This HOA genuinely thought they could control what happened on our farm. And then Karen arrived. Karen was a self-appointed queen of Whispering Pines. She drove around the subdivision in a golf cart like she was commanding military operations, clipboard always in hand, sunglasses on, permanent look of disapproval on her face. One afternoon, she drove her little golf cart right up to the edge of our property and started listing violations like she was reading criminal charges. According to Karen, our barn needed to be repainted in something she called border beige. She said our fencing didn't meet community standards. Then she complained that the smell from our cattle was offensive to nearby homeowners. I tried explaining calmly that this wasn't a suburban backyard. This was a working farm. Cows smell like cows. Roosters crow. Tractors exist. That's what happens on farmland. I also reminded her that we were not part of her HOA, and because of that, her rules meant absolutely nothing to us. She just smirked at me and said, "We'll see about that. This community has standards." After that, the letters started escalating. Soon we were getting certified mail. Then came the fines. $500 for the unapproved barn color. $1,000 for rooster noise violations. $2,000 for what they called agricultural nuisance conditions. The whole thing was completely ridiculous. That's when I hired a lawyer. He sent the HOA an official response explaining our property rights in very direct terms. The letter made it painfully clear they had zero legal authority over our farm or anything happening on it. Honestly, I thought that would finally put an end to the nonsense. But with Karen, it's never really over. She had convinced herself she was defending civilization itself. In her mind, she represented order, cleanliness, and suburban perfection, and she wasn't about to let some century-old farm stand in the way of that fantasy. Then everything exploded one Tuesday morning. I was out repairing a section of fence near the south pasture when I heard engines roaring down our gravel driveway. 3 black SUVs came flying toward the house. Before I even had time to process what was happening, several men in tactical vests and dark suits jumped out of the vehicles, looking deadly serious. One of them approached me immediately and flashed a badge. FBI. I nearly dropped my hammer right there in the dirt. The FBI at my farm. The lead agent informed me they had received what he called a credible report involving suspicious large-scale chemical manufacturing operations supposedly taking place on my property. Then he explained the tip specifically mentioned massive quantities of dangerous agricultural chemicals being stored and distributed from our farm. The agent explained that the report described strange chemical odors, large storage tanks, and suspicious activity happening late at night on our property. I looked from a serious expression on the agent's face toward the edge of the driveway, and there she was, Karen, sitting proudly in her golf cart near the property line, watching the entire scene unfold with the biggest smug grin I had ever seen on a human face. That woman had actually called the FBI on my farm. She had taken perfectly normal farming operations, fertilizer storage, irrigation tanks, tractors running late during harvest season, and somehow twisted them into some imaginary criminal operation. For a second, I honestly couldn't even process how ridiculous the whole thing was. Then I started laughing, not in a rude way, not mocking the agents. It was a kind of laugh that comes out when something is so unbelievably absurd your brain doesn't know how else to react. The lead agent frowned immediately. "Sir," he said sternly, "this is not a joking matter." I took a breath and nodded. "Oh, I know that," I replied, "but somebody has seriously misled you." Then I invited them to inspect the entire property. I walked them through the farm personally. I showed them the large tanks Karen had apparently described as suspicious chemical containers. In reality, they were nothing more than water storage and liquid fertilizer systems we'd used for years. I explained that the so-called strange smells were simply a wonderful combination of manure, livestock, wet soil, and fertilizer, otherwise known as normal farm life. To their credit, the agents stayed professional the entire time, but you could visibly see the moment they realized what had happened. The entire investigation was nonsense. The lead agent kept glancing over toward Karen, while her confident smile slowly disappeared inch by inch. By the time they finished walking the property, she looked significantly less proud of herself. That's when I decided it was time for one final lesson. I walked back inside the farmhouse and returned carrying a large framed document along with an old rolled-up county map. The document was our original land grant from 1887, complete with signatures and seals. I carefully spread the map out across the hood of one of the FBI SUVs. "Gentlemen," I said, "this is an official county map from the records office." I pointed to the massive section of land belonging to our farm. Then I pointed to a tiny, neatly outlined square, beside it labeled Whispering Pines. "My family has owned this land since before this area officially became a county," I explained calmly. "And as it turns out, my cousin happens to be the county commissioner. My uncle is the sheriff, and my sister-in-law works as head of county zoning and planning." I slowly looked over at Karen. She had gone completely pale. Her golf cart suddenly sputtered to life like she was preparing for an emergency evacuation. The lead FBI agent stared at the map for several long seconds. Then he looked at me, then back toward Karen, who was now desperately attempting an awkward three-point turn on the narrow gravel path. Finally, the agent just shook his head. Under his breath, I heard him mutter something about misuse of federal resources. He apologized to me directly for the disruption and assured me there would absolutely be follow-up action taken, not against me, against whoever filed a false report. As the black SUVs finally drove away down the driveway, Karen had already disappeared back into her perfectly bathed suburban paradise. And after that, everything suddenly became very quiet. The threatening HOA letters stopped showing up. The ridiculous fines disappeared overnight. And according to local gossip, Karen wasn't just forced to resign as HOA president. She was also dealing with serious penalties for knowingly filing a false report with a federal agency. A few weeks later, the Whispering Pines HOA even mailed us a formal apology letter. Not only that, they actually offered to pay for repainting our barn any color we wanted. I politely declined. My barn looks perfectly fine, exactly the way it is. The whole situation taught me something important, though. Some people get so trapped inside their tiny little neighborhoods and their endless rule books that they forget the world existed long before they arrived. They forget that not every piece of land needs matching fences and approved paint colors. Some roots run deeper than subdivisions. My family has stood on that land for generations, and if I have anything to say about it, will still be there for generations to come. And Henry the Rooster? He still crows every single morning. Loud, proud, and completely HOA approved by absolutely nobody.